All right. How about this Raisina team? I really want to give a big thanks to Orko, Pushan, and all of Samir and Sanjoy's team who's made this such a phenomenal forum for all of us. Welcome to the conversation on innovation capital, ideas for Industrial Revolution 4.0. I'm Patrick Kilbride. I'm the Senior Vice President for Innovation Policy at the U.S. Chamber of Commerce in Washington, D.C. And as we look at the path to Industrial Revolution 4.0, I think there are three traps that we need to be conscious of. There's the old Malthusian trap, there's the middle income trap, and there's what I'll call the missing capital trap. As we all know, the Malthusian trap was the idea that as production grew, population grew, and so that overall living standards would never improve. But the first industrial revolution, led by the creation of an intellectual property system, blew that trap away. And today we see an explosion of technological solutions to technical problems, of hunger, of disease, of energy production. And this is something that we have to nurture and sustain. We can't take it for granted. We have to remember how we got here. We have a middle income trap where countries, to reduce it to its simplest terms, haven't been able to make the leap to a knowledge economy. And then, this, where I think we all find ourselves trapped at the current moment, looking for the way through, is this trap of missing capital, where we have a huge store of untapped capital locked away in knowledge assets, and while we're applying our knowledge, we're finding new ways to make use of it, we haven't yet figured out how to leverage it and how to get that financial boom that can come from unlocking these assets. But we have the great fortune of having a truly distinguished panel this afternoon who can help to share some of their strategies for taking these next steps, for getting through these last traps, and really taking full advantage of the knowledge economy. On my right, from Lockheed Martin, Vice President of Strategy and Business Development, Vivek Lal. Vivek's been recognized by Cambridge University as one of the world's leading scientists. To his right, we have Pippa Hall, who is the Director of Innovation and Chief Economist at the United Kingdom Intellectual Property Office, the place where intellectual property was effectively born. We have India's own Amitabh Kant, the CEO of NITI Aayog, in a sense, India's thought leader in chief. And we have from Geneva, the Director General of the World Intellectual Property Organization, Francis Gurry. Under Francis's direction, WIPO has truly been a thought leader in exploring how we unlock our intangible assets to take full advantage of them. So in the time we have, I want to ask our panelists to help us understand what's next, what are the pitfalls that we have to avoid, and what are the great opportunities that we have in front of us. And I'm going to begin, give pride of place to our hosts. So I'll ask Amitabh, what's on your mind as you look at India's opportunities in the knowledge economy?
So to my mind, there's massive opportunity because we're in the midst of one of the biggest disruption that will take place in the world on account of artificial intelligence. And this will be a $15.7 trillion economy opportunity and that's $15.7 trillion according to PwC in its recent study, which is more than the GDP of USA and China combined. And for India, it presents a great opportunity because India is the only country in the world with 1 billion biometric, with 1 billion mobile, and 1 billion bank account. We've just come out with an artificial intelligence strategy document which talks about artificial intelligence for all. The Western world has always innovated. I mean, you go to Silicon Valley, it's very innovative, but it's always innovated for driverless cars, or it's innovated for war machines, which Vivek represents very effectively. But India's challenge is, like the challenge of much of the world, is how do you provide seed and fertilizer to your farmers based on weather and soil conditions? Or how do you provide access to quality health using technology? Or how do you leapfrog on improving learning outcomes in education? And one of the great things about India is that data is quite owned by public entities here, unlike USA, where data is owned by Google and Facebook, and unlike China, where data is owned by Alibaba and Tencent and Baidu. In India's case, data is owned by public entities. Aadhaar, which is a biometric, so over 1 billion Indians' data is owned by Aadhaar. Or GST, our biggest, it's one tax across the country. It's like one single tax across Europe. I mean, and this is totally a digitized database. Or the new health insurance scheme, Ayushman Bharat, which is providing health insurance to 500 million Indians. 500 million Indians means more than the population of America, Europe, and Mexico put together. And that's huge amount of data. And in India, 99.6% of Indians pay tax online. It's all digitized, and 96% of that gets settled within a period of 90 days. So that's massive, massive data. So you have huge amount of data. I mean, smaller countries like Singapore may have data, but these are small amount of data of small individuals. You have massive data. The challenge is how do you convert it into intelligent data? And that's what many of our startups are doing. I mean, amazing work is being done by some very dynamic startups. I mean, if you look at SigTuple, what does it do? It looks at all the data, blood, urine, X-rays all together, sends it to a pathologist, and gives you a result to the ultimate consumer, all within 5 minutes flat. Or what does SatSure does? It provides able to look at data of all farmers together in a defined area and give you exactly the amount of fertilizer you need to put in and exactly the amount of water you need to put in depending on soil and weather condition. It's all data, intelligent data through machine learning and artificial intelligence. So this is the massive opportunity. I mean, India is in the midst of, you have 400 startups doing artificial intelligence work, using this data which we are putting out in public domain to be able to make India one of the biggest disrupting countries in the world today. And that is really the dynamism of India today, to be able to disrupt in education. There's a young girl called Aditi who runs a startup called Imbibe. What is she doing? She is tracking every single boy who's studying, every single boy and girl who's studying in Rajasthan, tracking them down longitudinally, latitudinally, much like you track Uber cars, and on learning outcomes. So if you're not performing well in maths or history or psychology, you're giving extra class, all based on artificial intelligence, and the learning outcomes have jumped up radically on account of this. Or look at a young girl who started with Mandarin and Japanese, Pranshu Bhandari, who started with Mandarin and Japanese, and in 4 years' time has taught 45 million Indians how to speak English. She figured out that the challenge was not Mandarin and Japanese, but Indians wanted to learn English. 45 million Indians. No school or college has been able to do this. There's all the power of artificial intelligence. There's all the power of data being used as intelligent data through machine learning and artificial intelligence. So India is in the midst of one of the biggest disruptions, one of the biggest revolutions ever taken place anywhere across the world. And you'll see much of that progress happening. And why India is growing at 7.5% per annum year after year is because of the energy, vibrancy, and dynamism of many of these startups. When I joined my career and I was working, only 15% of the benefits that we used to pass on to our beneficiaries, many of these government schemes which go to the poorest of the poor, only 15% used to reach the poorest of the poor. Now in over 500 schemes, we are transferring money straight into the bank account of the beneficiary who takes it out using biometrics. The power of biometrics and straight into the bank account of the beneficiary. And therefore, we've done huge, huge savings, 90,000 crores, which has enabled us to spin out a number of social welfare schemes simply on the power of technology, simply on the power of biometrics, simply on the power of artificial intelligence. That's what India is doing. And this disruption, when it impacts India, it's not the 1.3 billion people of India, but it's the 7.7 billion people of the world who will be moving from poverty to middle class in the next 2 decades. And this is the big challenge. How do you transform the lives of 7 billion people of the world, rather than doing experiments around driverless cars and war machines?
Pippa, Amitabh makes a great case for the tremendous opportunity from applied data. Pippa, in your experience, do people know what they've got?
Yeah, I think that's quite often the case. So we talk a lot about the increase in intangible. Better? So we often talk about the increase in intangible assets, and we can see that there's this huge growth in the knowledge economy. But actually, I think on the ground, quite often people don't recognize what IP they have. And if they do, they don't recognize the value it has. And I think if we're really going to see this fourth industrial revolution, and we're really going to allow the intangible assets, the knowledge assets to grow, then we need to revolutionize the way that firms can get access to finance based on those intangible assets, the way that they can insure their assets so that they can protect them if they're being enforced. And so I think there's still a lot of work to do to get businesses to recognize what they actually have, its potential, and to monetize it. It's not an easy task. I think how you value something that's intangible is inherently really difficult. It's by the very nature. So if you take, for example, a patent, right, its very nature is that it's different and it's new and it's novel. And so how do you compare it to its comparator to get the market value? And I think that's where the trickiness comes. And we see countless in the UK firms saying we really want to get funding on our intangible assets so that we can grow. And we know that those SMEs, those technology-rich companies are the future for growing economies. And so if we want them to grow, then we need to find a way to allow them to have access to that finance. And that means we need to work globally to think about how we come up with kind of valuation markets to allow companies to really value the assets that they have and recognize them as their key asset to their company.
So, Vivek, you have the advantage of sitting at one of the world's, really leading multinationals with a lot of experience in the space. Are there some lessons that you could take from Lockheed Martin's experience dealing with data and artificial intelligence that may be applicable to countries that are trying to grapple with this, or small and medium enterprises in your supply chain?
Yeah, thanks, Patrick. I mean, global supply chains are hard to manage regardless, and with every country having its own laws and labor laws, IP laws, etc., one has to be able to be very methodical and careful in terms of how one distributes. Having said that, one of the key issues is human talent. And as you know, human talent migrates from not necessarily under any controls. And so to be able to do that in terms of innovation capital, it's very important that there's some basic nation-state catalysts that are put in place. One of them is education with practical experience at a very junior level, at the elementary school level. And I think we're finding that's very important, that at an elementary school level, the children are exposed to some of those programs. In the US, we have 4-H and FIRST as certain examples. In India, there's, for example, the Atal Innovation Mission and other places that's doing that. The second piece is at the university level, basic research, not only applied, but fundamental basic research. It's very important that that takes place. And the third is to provide a platform for entrepreneurship, and not just entrepreneurship, but access to capital. And I think that's, again, these are some of the ingredients that are very important to allow some sort of controls on and incentives for human talent. It's an ongoing issue, but I think it's an issue that's getting a lot of traction. As Amitabh said, this is unprecedented speed of Industry 4.0, and not only unprecedented speed, but the growth is nonlinear. And so to keep track of it, certainly a monumental task, and we have to stay ahead of the curve.
Francis, Vivek talked about the importance of nation states helping to provide some internal infrastructure. At a multilateral level, that may be even more important to ensure that countries aren't left behind. There's been some interesting comments over the course of this week about the rules-based multilateral system And you know, as we were discussing earlier, it is getting tougher to make rules, and yet WIPO plays a tremendous role in capacity building and informing the global community. What do they need to know on this, this AI space, the data space?
Well, thank you, Patrick. It's a very large question, but I think, look, what we see at the multilateral level, as no doubt has been discussed quite often during this dialogue, is that it is increasingly difficult to make rules internationally that apply to the whole world. And that's, of course, a difficulty in this area because data is mobile, or data are mobile. So there is an inherent need for having some rules that are going to define questions, fundamental questions like access. And especially as Amitabh has pointed out, value has shifted to data. Now, we have great difficulty internationally for a whole variety of reasons, but not the least of those is because innovation has become the basis of competition. And as innovation is increasingly digital and increasingly based on AI potential, then the capacity to make rules is limited because competitive interests are involved. So if you're at the World Health Organization, it's relatively easy to get a unity of purpose about the suppression of Ebola. Everyone is interested in the same thing. But when you're talking about innovation and intellectual property, rights in relation to the use of intellectual property and rights of access, then it's much more difficult. And then I think the other reason why it's very difficult to make rules internationally in this area is the one that you've just mentioned, Patrick, which is the enormous disparities of capacity that exists in the world. You have pre-industrial, industrial, and post-industrial economies trying to make rules about the same subject matter, and it's a competitive interest that they're making rules about. So this is difficult because at the same time we have fundamental questions. Fundamental questions about that we see every day, really, in the newspaper about data. And you have some strong cultural trends like the open data trends that you get in the scientific community, amongst others. But closure, competition, relies to some extent on closure. So there is a tension there. We need to start, I think, a conversation about these matters internationally. And it's all the more difficult, as I said, because this is the heart of competition at the moment.
Yeah, Amitabh, I think India finds itself in an interesting place in this global dynamic. Read yesterday in the Times that India was forecast to grow in excess of 7% this year. And India has, I think everyone would agree, a very innovative culture. And yet, there's always structural obstacles to fully taking advantage of that, to being able to unleash the transformative type of innovation that's going to disrupt and change the global economy for the better. What's on your plate to take full advantage of these developments?
So we're growing at about 7.5% per annum, but I think the challenge for India is really to grow at higher rates of about 9 to 10% consistently. India's grown at those rates for a short period of 4 to 5 years earlier. But the challenge is to grow on a consistent basis over a 3-decade period. And I think the only way to do it is if you can bring in, if you can use technology as a very major driver of growth. Number one, make a quantum jump in technology. That's critical because that enhances your productivity levels. Secondly, I think it's very important to make structural reforms, which India has done through GST, insolvency and bankruptcy code, RERA, many other structural reforms have been carried out. But I think the key thing will be how do you use cutting-edge technology, and quite often India gets into sunset areas of technology where the world market has already been captured. And to my mind, the key thing right now for which India is doing is really to get into based on its Paris commitments, is got into renewable energy in a very big way. India's strength really is the power of the sun. No other country has the huge amount of sunshine power which India has, and therefore it's pushed for 175 gigawatt of renewable power. And secondly, India's great advantage of the fact that the world is going to move in the next 3 to 4 years. There'll be a huge disruption, where the world is going to move from combustion cars to electric cars. India's advantage is that while America has 980 cars per 1,000 people, and Europe has about close to 900 cars per 1,000 people, India has only 20 cars per 1,000 people. So it does not have legacy issues. And all studies, Morgan Stanley, Bloomberg, all predict that till 2040, the biggest growth will happen in India simply because it has no legacy issues. And because of this, I think it's very important that as the cost of batteries falls very sharply from $276 to $75, when the cost of electric car will become on par with combustion car in the next 3-4 years, the key challenge will be how do you build up storage and battery. That is the biggest innovation. The world will be driven, to my mind, on both renewable and on automobile side by storage and batteries. And that is where the quantum technological jump India needs to make.
Pippa, what about the United Kingdom, the United States, more mature economies in a development sense, but does this current economic dynamic, this AI environment, does that create the potential for 7.5% growth in the UK in the future?
As an economist, I'm not sure I want to start predicting potential growth rates. But I think what I would say is that I'm not sure that we've got necessarily the legislative thinking quite up to speed with maybe where the technology is going. So we're seeing that the technology is racing ahead. We're seeing all this potential with AI, but actually, do we understand where it can be used, where it can grow potential sectors? And I think there's a danger that sometimes we identify, oh, it will be useful in that sector, and that's where we'll see the growth. But actually, this is such a fundamental change for all economies, and especially kind of looking at the US and the UK, in terms of do we understand which sectors? And I think it should be all sectors. And I think the other thing I'd say about, if you think about IP and innovation, it's around incentivizing. So IP is there to incentivize innovation. Well, have we thought about what happens when a machine creates it? How do we need to incentivize that machine to do it? And does the current IP regime, is that fit for purpose when we're talking about this AI? And I think that's where we need to be thinking as policymakers of how do we make sure that the policy is up to speed with the technology? And that's, for me, if we want to see this growth, we need to make sure we're thinking about that. Well,
we talked, Amitabh mentioned the community level ownership of data. We've talked about corporate ownership. What about the individual? Can we empower individuals to monetize their intangible assets and to really create value that can sustain them? Is there a meaningful path to that?
I think this is when it comes back again to making people realize what they have and whether they have the skills. And you talked a little bit about the kind of entrepreneurship skills, and Francis talked a bit about data sometimes being viewed as a bad thing. And I think that's often when it's thought of as an add-on. So actually, are we going into schools? Are we teaching people how to properly manage their data, how to understand it? Do we give them the skills to be entrepreneurs? Because they can invent, but if they're not entrepreneurs, they're never going to grow. And I think the same really exists for me thinking about data. It's do they understand what that data is? Do they understand what the potential is? And do they understand how it can work? And, even if you look at government, certainly in the UK recently, we've been looking at UK government data and its intangible assets. And actually, I'm not sure we've even thought about how we can best monetize those assets, or we can best kind of get the most out of them. And so, if we're still looking at it at that level, I think there's a lot of work to do to educate children around what that means for the future.
And Vivek, within a company like Lockheed Martin, what does it look like to do some forward planning and to be able to say, okay, what kind of asset development, intellectual asset development do we need to do as a company to get to the objective that we're trying to do, whether it's launching a new product? Can you walk us through that path and sort of that thought process a little bit?
Right, absolutely. So obviously invention is very different from innovation, and both are required. And so as we look out into the 30, 50, 100-year time horizons, we need both elements in place. But it's important to realize that innovation is really taking inventions and trying to solve practically societal issue or problem. And so when we talk about innovation at a country level or a company level or even at an individual level, I think it's important to have not only the academic risk takers and the research and development folks, but it's also important to make sure that the customers and there is a real pull. History will tell us that, you know, there was a lot of invention, for example, in the UK, but many of those inventions were then innovated in the US and vice versa. So I think keeping that perspective in mind is very important as we look at the longer term horizon.
Well, I think, not to put words in anybody's mouth and feel free to contradict me, but we might all agree that ownership rights vested in invention or innovation are necessary to see that commercialization process take place, which is where I think there's been a bit of a veil. We tend to look at innovation as a monolithic thing and not a process. Would you agree?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think the commercialization aspect is very important. I mean, the IIGP program that I talked to you about, a key element of that is access to capital, and not only access to capital, but taking that a step further is how do you get to commercialization, because there are lots of good ideas, and someone once told me there's no dearth of good ideas, but how do you get that to actually final execution and delivery of a product is very important.
So, Francis, you know, when we think about incentivizing innovation, we need to think about risk, because if you're trying to do something that is fundamentally new, there is the inherent risk that it won't work. And in fact, you know, if we look at the life sciences space, for instance, you look at long time frames, in some cases billions of dollars invested to bring a new drug to market, often involving multiple failures in the pipeline. What are the key fundamentals nations should be looking for to encourage risk-taking within their economies?
Well, one of the mechanisms, obviously, is the one that's just been mentioned by you, Patrick, and by Vivek, and that's one of the functions of property rights, is to provide a measure of certainty in respect of investments, particularly in intangible capitals. I think what we're seeing there, of course, is that, as you also mentioned, Patrick, many of the categories that we've used to describe intangibles did come out of the Industrial Revolution when we were moving from handicraft to industrial production. And with handicrafts, of course, it's the individual object that's important. With industrial production, it's the idea and the know-how that facilitates the industrial production of many similar objects. Now we're moving to a different set of values, which of course are based on data. And do the old categories fit? Well, the demand for intellectual property rights worldwide would tell us that they are doing not a bad job, because the demand for intellectual property rights worldwide is increasing by at least double the rate of increase in the world economy. If the world economy is increasing by 3.5%, we're seeing growth rates in intellectual property applications which are 7, 8, 9, 12%. So it's not that they don't fit completely, but there are unanswered questions out there. And these relate in particular to data. Whose data is it? And what are the rights of access in relation to data? And we're seeing many different policy perspectives in relation to this. We're seeing the personal data policy perspective, we're seeing the security policy perspective. To some extent we're seeing the competition policy perspective, we're seeing the integrity of data perspective, but we haven't yet discussed to a great extent the property rights perspective, and that's going to be extremely important. And what we're seeing is that there is a huge amount of value, commercial, exploitable value in data. But whose data is it? And we're seeing a lively public debate about this, and I think there will be an increasing consciousness on the part of individuals in our society about the value of their own data, whether the value for medical research or the value for commercial exploitation in advertising, but the value of your data is going to become important, and we need to start to think of some ways of drawing some of the lines that is going to provide certainty of investment, certainty for investment on the one hand, but a reasonable social benefit from the exploitation of the data also.
That kind of begs a question that's on my mind a lot as the representative of businesses, which is, have we come to take innovation for granted? Is there an unwillingness to return a fair value for innovation? One sense is that we think that it will just keep coming and coming, and you wonder if that's true. Do we have questions from the floor? Please we'd be happy to take some questions. Okay, in the stripe.
Hello, I'm Aileen Agüero from Peru, the Institute for Peruvian Studies. I would like to ask the Indian representative, please, if you could comment on any measures or actions that have been taken into account by the Indian government to protect or take good care of the huge amount of information that it has from the Indian citizens. Thank you.
Let's take a few, and then we'll invite the panelists to answer. So we'll go over to the right side and then come back to the middle.
Hi everyone, my name is Veronica Portugal. I am from Mexico, and I want to ask Pipa and Mr. Amitabh, what public policies have implemented India to develop and foster its innovation ecosystem that can be copied by Latin American countries in order to achieve significant economic growth?
Okay, and we'll take one more from the middle, and then we'll go back to the panel.
My name is Aditya Bharadwaj, and I'm a law student. As automation and AI have been becoming more prominent in industries, how can governments ensure meaningful jobs for everybody, as not everybody will be able to tap into the intellectual market? And further, particularly in the case of India and other developing countries where that many manufacturing jobs will not be available in the future because of automation, and also the possibility whether universal basic income can come in and fill that void in a manner.
Okay. We will take those and then come back in just a moment. Anybody want to jump in?
You want to go first?
Okay, so I'll talk a little bit about policies in terms of how I think we encourage people to do more innovation. And I think that actually starts at the school level and then the business level. So it's all about education and giving people the tools to understand what innovation is, how we encourage more people into science, technology, engineering, and maths, and also how we then go into businesses and teach them the tools of how to exploit it. So a lot of the kind of softer policy skills that we've implemented in the UK is very much around teaching innovation, getting that thought process of IP belongs to everybody, everybody has a right in creating it, and then they can take that on as a career. And I think if we want to see innovation continue to grow, and if we want to ensure that happens in all countries, then it's the kind of how do we get that out at the grassroots levels, I think is the key message I'd answer.
So on innovation, actually we copied the British system of education, the Anglo-Saxon system of education, where you study with books, you pass, you get into the next class, you again study books and you get into the next class, and you keep studying books all your life. So we've totally disrupted that. We've started these close to 3,500 tinkering labs from class 6 onwards, where we provide robots, 3D printers, we provide Internet of Things, all from class 6 onwards. And we do a lot of mentoring by outside faculties, and we've seen a huge amount of competition, a huge amount of innovation and competition taking place at school level. And suddenly we find students becoming extremely innovative simply because we've opened their minds to a lot of new. So we plan to open about 100,000 tinkering labs in the next 5 years. That's our target. Plus we support a lot of incubation centers across all our institutions. And now in all our colleges, we'll be teaching artificial intelligence across all our institutions. So therefore, we're pushing for a highly innovative, a very, very innovative methodology of teaching across all our, plus we have about close to 2.6 million STEM graduates. That's 4 times the number of STEM graduates that the United States of America has. So a very vibrant ecosystem of very innovative people all across, and that's why we have close to about 400 startups of artificial intelligence. We're trying to build up a very, very vibrant, dynamic ecosystem of young disruptors at the school level itself. Secondly, there was a question asked about privacy of data. We are a very vibrant democracy. There's been a huge, huge debate in India across privacy of about data, because we take biometric. This was subjected to a huge judicial test before the Supreme Court of India. And the Supreme Court of India, after very prolonged hearing, gave its judgment that making Aadhaar legally valid, and therefore it's incumbent upon the government to ensure the privacy of data. And a lot of care has been taken, and that's why there's been not been even a single breach of the Aadhaar data. And that's why we've been able to link up, close to about 142 banks are linked up through a unified payment interface at the back. And all of us in India actually use our mobile payments to make digital payments. For the last 1 year, I've not used my debit card, credit card, or my ATM machine. I just use my mobile instrument for all my debit and credit. And I use that and therefore my view is that since we've ensured privacy of data across Aadhaar, across UPI, across tax, India will probably be the first country in the world which in the next 4 to 5 years will make debit card, credit card, and ATM machines technologically redundant. All of us will be transacting, doing all our debit and credits and all our procurement and purchases only using mobile telephony for digital payments. And privacy of data is very, very sacrosanct in India. But it's also important that we put out this data in a very transparent manner in public domain, so that many of our startups are not data starved. It's all intelligent data, and it must be used intelligently to bring in innovation. And we also put out this data in public domain for academicians to do research. That's critical. And that's important to make India a very innovative society, and that's what we are doing.
I think to your point, the speed of the economy increases. The faster money moves, the more money you have. And Francis, did you want to weigh in, and then we'll go back to the floor?
Patrick, yeah, if I can just wander briefly into the minefield of jobs with this extremely good question and say that, well, obviously there's a large debate out there as to whether the technology is replacing or displacing labour. And I tend to the view that it's a displacement that is going on. But putting it another way, what people were selling, what workers were selling in the past was their labour. What people will be selling in the future is their data. Now, at the moment, they're not selling it. They're giving it away. And the distribution platforms and the internet giants are benefiting from this in a major way. And this is an extremely important point, and I think it's why there will be a development, an enhanced consciousness about one's data and the value of one's data. But in that last comment, in that important transition of value that we see that is taking place, and the displacement of labour and its movement to a different area in the value chain, it is certain that some people are going to get lost. And a major policy task is to address those who cannot make the shift. And that's perhaps a whole generation of people before the education system catches up with them.
You got to wonder, we've often talked around the world about a problem having many people who were overeducated and underemployed, and you wonder if we're not on the verge of seeing that problem go away, being able to apply their knowledge much more usefully. Let's take these 5 questions, and then we'll move towards a conclusion. Let's start in the middle, and then we'll go over to the right, okay?
Dr. Tejpal Ahluwalia, former scientist, GE and senior DDG, Indian Council of Medical Research. Artificial intelligence. It is beyond my understanding how the intelligence can be artificial. It should be intelligence articulated. It should not be AI, it should be IA, intelligence articulated. Now when the application of IA, I should call it IA, intelligence articulation, when the articulation of intelligence, human intelligence will increase over a period of time, my question is, don't it will have a IPR when it will be legal scrutiny in certain areas of applications, and IPR scrutiny of certain areas of application will have certain problems if we call it artificial intelligence, because it is not conveying the right meaning of intelligence. Medical terms, intelligence can never be artificial. It should be artificial, articulated, or artified. Thank you.
It sounds like a question for Vivek because he's so smart.
My question is anybody's.
Yeah. Let's take the remaining questions and then we'll address them at once. So we'll go over to the right and then back to the middle.
Hello, my name is Aurelio. I'm from Brazil, a country that 2 decades ago went through a litigation to discuss the legitimacy of patents when it comes to life-saving drugs, namely HIV. And I wonder, do you envision such a discussion on the property and intellectual property of artificial intelligence that, who knows, in the future end up proving to be as life-saving as certain drugs? And if so, what consequences do you see?
Good question. Okay, in the middle.
Yep, thank you for a great panel. I'm Janet from the UN Environment Programme. So my question is to Amitabh and Vivek. The IPCC, the International Panel on Climate Change, has said we have about 12 years to stay within the 2-degree climate change target. And what you've mentioned in the panel is that the Industry 4.0 movement will radically change our production and consumption patterns. So my question is, to what extent is the government, especially a planning organization like NITI Aayog, going to explicitly link these two agendas so that the Industry 4.0 changes can be leveraged to address climate change mitigation? And Vivek, I'd like to hear from a private sector perspective, what kind of incentives would motivate more private sector investments into Industry 4.0 investments that address climate change and sustainability?
Thank you. Okay, two more, I'm sorry, we have, looks like 3 more questions. I think the young lady in the back's been waiting, and then we'll come to you.
Okay, so good evening. My name is Park Hwan, and I'm from Thailand Ministry of Commerce. My question will be, what is your opinion about the forced technology transfer, which is one of the causes of the US-China trade war now? And do you think it's justifiable for developing countries to set technology transfer as a requirement for foreign direct investment, since some of the developing countries are lack of innovation and human capital who are capable of that? And my second question is, what is your thought on the data localization? Thank you.
Yeah. Okay, here and then in the middle.
Yeah, I want to make the CEO of NITI Aayog my addressee of my question. I intend to elicit response from him. Sir, there are talks like a dozen of companies know more about the people of India than the millions of Indian gods know about its citizens. So in a society where these companies are sharing data and informations and they're selling also, how do you look at this, this picture? And after this Cambridge Analytica scam, what would you talking about this digital and civic partnerships and very fewer engagement of companies? That's my question.
All right, very quickly, 30 seconds or less.
Hi, I'm Nipun from India. My question is to Mr. Francis Gurry. In a world where we are seeing a clear digital divide, clear data divide between a data poor nation and a data rich nation, how do we ensure that the data, that we create a platform to ensure a fair share of data, fair exchange of data between 2 countries or 2 individuals or 2 partners? Thank you.
Truly all great questions. I know we can't answer all of them, but why don't we, Francis, we'll begin with you and give each of the panelists a chance to share some final thoughts in response to these questions and other things that you may want to offer.
Okay, thanks, Patrick. Look, I'll make these my final thoughts too. So for Brazil, if I may say, I'm sure that question is going to arise. There are going to be life-saving innovations based on data and artificial intelligence in the biomedical field. And it's a question of balance, I think. So on the one hand, we need to create the right economic incentives to ensure that there is investment in innovation and that we do get innovation, which has all of the positive merits that we know about for economic growth and for improvement in quality of life. And on the other hand, there's not much good in having innovation if its social benefit cannot be enjoyed or shared. So it's a question of finding, I think, the right balance. On just a quick word from Thailand, a large question on technology and technology transfer. Look, I think it's in question of the effectiveness of the measure. So if you impose a measure to enforce technology transfer, is it going to work? You know, technology is a resource like any other resource, and it happens to be a resource which is occupying a bigger and bigger portion of the total economic value. Are you going to be actually cutting off your nose to spite your face by introducing such a measure, or do you want to adopt a different approach to the matter? And then on the last point, I think, which is how to ensure fairness well, I think that, you know, this is what property rights should all be about. It's about finding, at least intellectual property rights, finding the right balance between a lot of competing interests that come into play in and around innovation. They're the interests of the consumer, the general public, they're the interests of the producers, and they're the interests of the economy in ensuring that we have the right incentives in place to ensure that we're going to get investment in innovation, which we know we need, because if we don't do things differently, we're going to be left with the same problems that we have now, be they the problems of climate change or the problems of extreme poverty. We need innovation, so we need to create the right incentives, but also we need a fair system for sharing it.
Thank you. Amitabh, final thought from you?
You know, to that young lady from Brazil who asked the question on climate change, you know, to my mind, the challenge is not about manufacturing, but the real challenge is going to be about urbanization. Because, you know, when America urbanized and when Europe urbanized, land, gas, and water were all cheaply available. And because they were cheaply available, Americans had the luxury of making cities like Atlanta where 99.8% of the people travel by cars. So American car companies actually bought over the railway companies and destroyed them. So America was made for cars and not for people. Process of urbanization has ended across America, Europe, it's nearing its completion in China. But in India, the process of urbanization has just begun. You know, as I speak here today, there are 30 Indians moving from rural areas to urban areas every minute. By 2050, according to the latest McKinsey study, we'll see 700 million Indians moving into the process of urbanization. The challenge is, how do we avoid the mistakes which America and Europe have made in the urbanization process? How do we stop making sprawling cities? How do we stop making cities for cars? How do we recycle our water and recycle our waste? That is the challenge. How do we make cities on the back of public transportation? That is the challenge. And I think India's challenge, biggest challenge is how do you do innovative and sustainable urbanization, which can then become a model for the rest of the world. And I think this is the biggest challenge which India is confronted with. And secondly, I think that is why I stressed on the need for renewable energy, which government of India is driving in a very big way, 175 gigawatt of power. And secondly, the biggest challenge of moving from from combustion cars to electric cars in a very big way, so that storage and battery will become a very major driver of change and sustainability in the Indian context. And thirdly, in the context of manufacturing, how do you digitize the entire manufacturing process? Because from consumer right till the manufacturing process, it will be the digital process which will really decide the process of manufacturing and ensure that the consumer gets what he's decided, and that is conveyed at the field level in the manufacturing place. So these three things will be the critical processes. The process of urbanization, the process of the transformation of transportation in India, and the process of renewable energy, and lastly the process of manufacturing.
Any very last quick thought, or should we make that the last word? Vivek? Last word? I will just say thank you to this outstanding panel, to ORF. Knowledge is the shale oil of today's economy. It's untapped. These people are the ones who can help you tap it. Thank you.